All right, so I want to do a little bit of test-driven development and kind of walk you through how you can do TDD with a React application. Now, I do want to say, before you actually get committed to watching this video, the things I'm doing in this video are not the convention that people typically do in React. So what I'm doing is I'm still building upon a prototype that I did in a previous video where I'm trying to apply the MVC architecture to React itself, right? So I want my components to be as dumb as possible and to have the least amount of logic as possible, okay? So you're going to see that in this project, like I built out my own little MVC wrapper where basically you have this thing, this function you pass in a view, a controller, and a model, and then some additional context that we'll talk about maybe. And it kind of tacks it all together and gets it to work in such a way that you can now easily test your controller. Regardless of if you even think this approach is good or over engineering, I want to show you how you can use test-driven development to build out features in the UI. So we'll probably run into some snags, but we're going to try to do some live coding real quick. So this is the application. We have a component, and when you click on create assignment, it shows a modal, and it's supposed to show some errors down here when the user has tried to submit it without typing the actual like values here. So there's some stuff that we need to implement, and I have some like basic tests written out to help us do some TDD to implement this logic. Okay, so I think this does work. Like if I were to go ahead and put like ABC 1, 2, 3 and click create, it does create the card. So the modal works, but the validation is just not working, right? So if I can create cards with blank names, which is not good. Okay, we don't want that. All right, so before we dive into doing the test-driven development, I need to give you a walkthrough of what I'm doing. So I have this MVC wrapper here, but the thing that's important to note is that the views I'm using are super dumb. All they do is when you click on a button, it calls some function, and when it renders out, it just grabs something from the model, okay? That's it. There's no if statements, there's no hooks anywhere. Everything is always passed in props, and there's a reason I do that because it helps the component be easier to refactor down the road. If you end up having these components that have all these hooks, and then those components have more components, and then inside those components you have more hooks and more stuff that's happening on, it just becomes really hard to refactor, especially when you need to start elevating state or lifting state. And there's a really smart guy who makes some really good frameworks. I forgot his name. I think it's like Christopher Alphonse, who made Cerebral.js and Overmind.js. His argument is just put all the state of your application in the global store so that you can easily test and verify when things are changing the way they should be. And I think I kind of see eye to eye with what he's saying. It just makes more sense. Because when you have the state nested in all your components, first of all, it's like super impossible to unit test anything. And second of all, like it just makes it harder to refactor because now you have to like lift up state just to move components around versus if it was always just in a higher state at the begin with, you don't have to deal with that. I mean, there might be some rendering performance issues with that. I'm not going to dive into that. But anyway, let's walk you through. So the controller is the brains behind the view I just showed you, right? So the view at the bottom, this takes in a controller, and that controller has actions and models. So if I go ahead and go to the controller up here, this is when the controller actually initializes. So everything in here is only going to run once. This only runs once, and this returns an object that has a bunch of references to actions and state that you can mutate. I'm a fan of mutating state. I know immutable code is quote unquote better if you're one to follow that dogma, but what I do is when this controller actually mounts, I do a request and I get some assignments and I put it on the model. Okay. And if we look at the model has a couple of things on it as well. We have assignments, which is an array. We have a show modal, true or false. And then we have a form. And this form is where we're typing into that modal over here. So like name and description. So everything in this entire page and all the subcomponents and all those subcomponents of those subcomponents, they're all modifying and accessing the exact same top level model. This might be bad. You can argue in the description if you think this is bad, but that's besides the point. If we look down here in the controller, we have all these actions that we can call from the view. And these actions basically do updates on the model, right? They change the model. They might do an asynchronous call to get something. For example, when you call create assignment, this does a post request to an endpoint. And I have this get context thing. This is the approach I'm taking to make sure these controllers don't have like random hooks all in them and like it just becomes a mess if you start having hook code in here. So we have this get context callback. And what this thing is doing is it has some methods, and that's where all the hooks live, right? So if I need to get like an ID from the next router, I can call a hook there. If I need to get TRPC and do a mutation, I have that hook there. And I can do the queries, I can do the mutations manually. And that's kind of the way my brain works. I think this makes more sense than having like all these different custom hooks that do all this stuff. Yeah, the main point I'm getting at is how do I add features using this approach, and why would I do this to begin with? And I'm hoping I can kind of show you like my perspective by doing some type of TDD and kind of share with you how this works. So I have a test suite that does a lot of stuff. We basically create some mock assignments and we mock out that context stuff to have it just return some fake data and do some fake stuff. And then we also can spy on these things later to make sure that they're called. So for an example, like we're testing that when this controller is initialized, it should fetch some assignments and store them on the model. So I can just initialize a controller. I do have to wait some random time. I think just 1 millisecond so that it has time to resolve all the internal promises. But then I can check to make sure is assignments set equal to mock assignments, which happens to be defined up here as just an array of one assignment, okay? And the reason this is working is because we mock it out here. So we have tests that verify certain things happen when the controller is created, all right? So if you were to kind of use React testing library, you check that when the component mounts and the first use effect fires, it does some state stuff, it updates state. But you wouldn't check state with React testing library. You would check that certain components are rendered out to the page, which is like a combination of like you're testing the UI, which why are we testing the UI? We trust React knows how to render something when we give it a .map, right? We trust React knows how to conditionally show something if we give it a true or a false. So unit testing is important. That's I don't know why people say it's not and they try to downplay it. I think it's important. But let's just try to go through here and let's see if we can, first of all, there's some broken tests and some failing stuff, which I probably need to fix. So the first test, this is all written in Jest, by the way, and you can easily run this test file just by doing npx jest and passes the path of the file. But this one's failing, should not try to create the assignment if there are form errors. So again, this was like going back, when I click create here, it actually creates the assignment, which is not what we want. So we want to write a test to make sure that if there are form errors, it doesn't actually submit anything. Which right now it's failing because I gutted a lot of the code just to kind of give you an example of like how this works. So first of all, if we wanted to get this working, I think this is complaining because I deleted something, but we have like this test, which when someone tries to submit the form, we want to make sure that it doesn't actually call this mock method. This is the method that actually calls the backend and tries to submit data. So the test is saying like when the controller is created and we try to create the assignment, make sure that the mock call to the backend is never called, right? So not to have been called. This is actually not passing. So we need to go back to the component and go back to the code and make this pass, right? So the first thing I would do is let's just pretend that this thing, the model that we talked about, has create assignment errors, right? We want to keep track of what errors are in the actual model. So let's go back to where this was defined, and I'm going to go ahead and say create assignment errors, and I'm going to go ahead and just like copy this code right here. Okay, so now we can actually track errors when the user tries to submit and they didn't actually fill in the right stuff. The second thing I'm going to do is I want to go ahead and put, I'll say like name is required. So we'll pretend that there's an error text or string, and we're going to use this to track when there's errors in the form. Okay. So now when I run this code, again, this should still not pass because we didn't add logic to prevent it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go to create assignment, and we need to look through this code to figure out, is there a way we can like add logic to this to prevent it from submitting to the backend when there's an error. Okay, so the first thing we should probably do is we should probably validate this entire form. Okay, so let's make a function up here at the top. I'm going to say const validate form, and I'm going to go ahead and just like check if model.form.name, if it's not set, we could just keep track of like let is valid is true, and then if this is not set, I'll set it equal to false. And then we could just return is valid at the end. And what we could actually do as well is like we could probably keep track of the errors. So like if we validate the form and this thing is not set, then let's just go ahead and say model dot create assignment errors dot name is equal to, I'll just say like name is required. Simple as that. And then we're going to do the same thing with the description. So if the description was not set, I'm going to go ahead and say like description is required. So now we got a function that when we call it, it's going to set these things up for us. And it's also going to return true or false to know if this thing was valid. So if it wasn't valid, it's going to return false. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say if this thing is not valid, to validate the form, I'm going to go ahead and just return. So don't allow any of this code to run if the form is not valid. And I know there's like React form hooks you can use or whatever libraries you want to use. Again, then you start getting into this whole mess of like you're using all these hooks and stuff just gets really complicated. So let's go back to our test and let's verify if we run this, it should hopefully pass now because like we added logic to prevent it from submitting when the form is not working. And we can actually kind of verify this. If I go ahead and just delete this, this should fail now because now it's going to actually, so I think what I actually need to do is like the form needs to, I was showing you the wrong thing. So let's pretend like it has no validation errors to begin with. Like we could just say name is empty and description is also empty, right? This is typically how the modal would look like. But name, we could put Bob, and description, we could put empty. And that should not submit, right? If no one has typed into the description, then this thing should not have been called. And we could also check like more stuff if we wanted to. Like we could check if the modal or if the controller model assignment errors dot description, I could say to be defined, right? I could run that and just verify that it's defined. I could also say to equal, and then I could say like description is required. Okay, so that's like a test case to verify that it's going to actually print this out. And now at this point, like we can try to, we have good certainty that our test is working and this logic should work. So when I tried to create, notice that the button doesn't do anything, right? So I didn't even need to do anything in the UI, and I had confidence that like my code does exactly what it's supposed to do. So let's go in through here and actually like hook the stuff up to the placeholders because it's always cool to see stuff be displayed on the page. So we could simply pass in these errors into this component here. I'm gonna go ahead and say errors. Go ahead and just say like errors as well. And I'm gonna find where this thing is being called, which I think we call it down at the bottom. So I'm gonna pass in the errors from modal.form errors, and there we go. So if we want to dynamically render out this placeholder stuff, we could say errors.name and like this. And just go ahead and do that. I'm gonna do the same thing with the description. I'll just copy this and I will change this to description. And honestly, I'd probably abstract some of this away so it's not so like duplicated, but that's besides the point of this video. So now when we were to create this, notice that it doesn't actually display. So let's try to figure out why that's not displaying. And in fact, I do think there is like behind the scenes, I'm doing some janky logic to like update state. So I think what we might need to do is we might have to figure out where we're validating the form. Yeah, I think the way it works is like you have to kind of actually do this. Unfortunately, I need to find a workaround for that, but we can kind of set the description and set the form value error there. And I think that'll actually fix it. So let's just go ahead and say name is required. Let's see, does that actually fix it? There we go. So I'm using like a shallow proxy, which is why like I had to do that weird equal signs. You've seen this in Svelte where like in order to get this working, let me show you a little workaround as well. So in order to get this working, you have to kind of tell the proxy that you're like reassigning. So a quick little hack that you can do that sometimes in Svelte they tell you can do as well is you can just reassign itself to itself and the proxy will kind of see that it's been changed. And the only reason it's doing that is because I haven't done like a deep proxy check on this like little MVC wrapper I've created. But let's just go back to the other approach because it's probably more proper. All right, description is equal to this modal dot create assignment errors. So hopefully that kind of made sense as to why I have to do this weird stuff. It's because I'm doing my own like little prototype stuff, which I'll fix it. I'll make it better. I just haven't gotten around to it. All right, so hopefully this works now in the UI. So now you notice that when I actually close this modal and load it back up, like the validation stuff is still there, which is weird. Like we should be clearing out the validation when we open the modal. So let's see if we can write another test. And now that we've kind of gotten a warm up on test-driven development, let's see if we have some more stub tests written out that we might be able to kind of implement. So here's another one. Should not show validation until the form has been submitted for the first time. Should validate the form when input changes. There's probably another one. Should clear the modal inputs after creating a whatever. All right, so I already have one. Should reset the form and error state when opening the modal. So this one is not passing for whatever reason. So I need to go and figure out why this one is not working. And it's probably just because we need to implement it. Okay, so if you run that test, you'll see that it's saying that description is required is still being displayed, but it expected that it did not display. So let's look at the test case real quick and let's kind of examine what's going on here. So we have a controller here. We have a form that has Bob and the description of empty. And then the create assignment errors is still set to description is required. And then we call open the form. We try to open the modal. And the test is saying that like when we try to open the modal, like all this stuff should be reset back to 0, but for some reason this is lingering around. So we have to go and make this test pass. So again, we already wrote the test. Unfortunately, like this was my bad. I meant to delete this one so we can kind of do it from scratch, but let's go back to the controller and let's find out where we call this method. So to make this thing pass, what we could simply do is just reset the errors back to blank, right? If we do this and we go ahead and just run that test again, the test passes, which again gives us confidence that we can go to the UI and like when we have some errors and we close and come back, those errors have been cleared out. Okay, that's exactly what we're trying to verify. Cool. So let's see if we can find a test that's like more not already written for us. I'm gonna get rid of the only. I'm gonna go ahead and just run this code base and see what happens. Everything's passing, so that's good. So we have another one here. It says, should set the submitted attempted to false when opening the modal. So let's say UX comes to you or your designer comes to you and says, hey, you know, like when people type into this, only after they've submitted do we want it to run validation, all right? So maybe we can find another test case that's like implementing that logic. So should not show validation until submitted, should validate the form when input changes. All right, so let's try to make a test to make this one pass. Should validate the form when input changes. So if someone loads this form and types something in and then like deletes everything, we want it to show an error here, right? Like, because name is required, so we should show them so that they don't like try to submit this without name. So how do we implement this test? Well, I would go here and I would probably copy an existing test, paste that in, and we'll figure this out. But I think what we want to do is the form should start off with nothing. So name could be blank, description could be blank, and then the errors, I'll make sure those are also blank because we probably want to make sure that they're set to something when the user starts typing. In fact, I'm gonna put name as Bob and description as like math. Okay. And what I'm gonna do is I want to test that when someone typed in Bob and math and they come back through and they delete math, I want that error to show up. So I'm gonna say call an action called set create assignment form value. I'm gonna go ahead and pass it the key of name, and I'm gonna pass it the value of empty string. So this is going to basically pretend like the user is typing into the input box and setting name back to empty. And at that point, we want to verify that like validation was reran, and now we get an error. Okay, so we should probably check that this thing dot name, we could say like to be defined, I guess. Okay, so let's just run this test real quick. I'll put an only here, and I'll go ahead and just expand that code. And it looks like it's actually passing for some reason. What is this actually set to? Name is required. Okay, so just is a little weird. To be defined actually passes with an empty string, which does not go, it kind of goes against what you should know in TypeScript and JavaScript. So this test is now failing. It's expecting name is required, but like we're still getting blank. So what does that actually mean? It means that the test is actually verifying that like when someone types in Bob and then deletes it all out, it's expecting that we have an error on the page, right? But right now we don't get any of that, which is exactly what we're seeing. You delete Bob, we don't get an error. So now we can actually go into the code. We have a test, and we're certain that the test is written properly. If we go into the code, and basically when you change the form anywhere, you could simply just say validate form. Okay. So now let's rerun our test real quick and make sure that we've made the test pass. And now the test is passing, and now we have confidence we can go back and we can actually type in Bob, delete it, and now name is required is printing out in both places for some reason. So we'll have to go and figure out why that's happening. I probably have, probably in the view. So if I go to the view real quick, I probably have like name twice. Yeah, I have it here. So that was my bad. All right, so let's try it again. I'm gonna go ahead and type Bob and delete it. Okay. So that's cool, but the issue as you saw is like when I typed in Bob, it went ahead and validated a description. So we need to figure out how to fix that, and luckily I do have another test kind of ready to go for verifying that. So let's see if we can find where that is. Should not show validation until the form has been submitted for the first time. So awesome. Let's try to implement this one. So don't validate anything until someone's tried to submit the form. Okay, so let's write a test for this. Grab all this code. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make sure that if I have it set to Bob and I clear it out, that both name and description are going to be equal to the empty string. And what we're going to do basically is when someone types into the input box, we want to make sure that the errors don't show up only when the form hasn't already been submitted. So I need to track using test-driven development. I'm trying to design the implementation before I go to the implementation. So I want to pretend on the state, there's something called like submitted form was submitted. Right, I'm going to say that this was, I'll just say is submitted. Maybe that'd be easier. So I'm going to set it equal to false, and notice I'm getting a bunch of like TypeScript errors because we don't have that thing defined on our model. So let's just go ahead and say is submitted is false and go back to our test. And again, like this test is verifying if this thing is false, then this should never show validation, right? So let's just go ahead and find the onlys, delete them. And we probably want to put the only on this one now. In fact, let's just not even put the onlys. Let's just run the entire suite. We want to make sure we're not breaking other things. So the test is failing, and it's failing for the right reasons, right? It's expecting this thing to be blank because we haven't submitted the form yet, but it's still printing out the errors. So that's something that we need to go to the code base and figure out how to fix. So how do we do that? Well, let's go to the controller, and let's probably go to where we submit the form, which is here. And when you try to do it for the first time, I'm going to say is submitted is true. Okay. And now if I run the test, let's make sure that this test actually passes, which it's not passing yet. So let's see if we've messed something up. Actually, yeah, there's still more that we have to change, right? So we're just marking when we actually tried to submit the form, which is good. But we also need to like not validate the form when the user changes stuff, right? So we have like when the user types, we're calling this form validation. Maybe we should say if modal or model dot is submitted. That's the only time that we need to validate. So after you submitted, validate the form, right? So let's go ahead and run this and make sure this thing tries to pass. Yeah, so it's still failing. Let's try to figure out why it's failing. So again, like if the form has Bob and math with no errors and it hasn't been submitted yet, and you type, if you change name to be empty, we should expect name to become empty. We should expect the errors for name and description to remain empty, right? Let me actually make sure that this is the right test. Okay. So I got confused. This is actually a different test that's failing. So the test that we were working on, this is passing now, right? If I were to show you, if I do only run this test and kind of pull this up, we've actually fixed that test, but we broke another test because we have to go back and try to figure out why. And I think the reason for this one is because this one should say should validate the form when input changes and form was submitted for the first time. Okay, so let's just go ahead and put a true there. And I think that should hopefully get us working. All right, so that's passing. Let's go back to the UI and hopefully everything should be good now. If I type in and delete, we get no validation. Awesome. But the moment you submit, that's when you start getting these validation errors like pop up, which is what we want, right? But I think there's still another bug, which we'll have to figure out, which is when you type into the input again and the form was submitted, these things should be clearing out because like we've set name, right? So when you run into bugs like this, it's always good to like double check or try to add more coverage to figure out what's going on. Instead of going straight to the code and trying to fix it, write a test that fixes the failing code. So I'm going to rerun my entire test suite one more time just to make sure that nothing is like missing or I forgot something. But the issue is, let me just go ahead and redo this. If I submit and then type in something, right, that should have cleared out my issues. And I think what this might be is if I go back to, yeah, let's just try to write a failing test first. So I'm going to go ahead and say, let's copy this whole thing here. And we're going to do like a more of like a sequence of things to check this. Where is the actions.create assignment? So this is the code that actually checks that we submitted it. And I'm going to go ahead and just do it in this one. So should validate the form when input changes and the form was submitted for the first time. Don't want that. Don't want this. So what we're trying to do is like we want to make the form and it's not submitted yet. And then we want to make sure that Bob and math are not defined. And then we're going to go ahead and submit it. So I'm going to say create assignment and wait on that. Like so. And then what we're going to do is we're going to type into the form. So I'm going to say controller actions set the value of, we could do like name, and then we can say value is testing. And we want to verify that like we now have the errors for only description because we just set name. Like if I were to go up here, like name should be equal to name is required. Description should be equal to description is required. Does that make sense? So when we first submit it, both those errors should pop up. Then we fill in name and we submit it again. Or we don't have to submit it. We fill in the name again, the testing, and now it should not have description. Right? So description should be, actually, I'm sorry, name should just be empty. It's getting late, I'm getting confused. So let's just go ahead and run this again. Now we have a failing test. And it's failing because it expected name to be empty, but name was required. And that's the exact same error that we're seeing in the page where like, for some reason, after you submit it, it doesn't clear the validation. So let's see if we can make this test pass by going back to the code base and going to the controller. I think I'm in the wrong file, maybe. Go to the controller and let's check. So when we submit the form, here, we're tracking it as is submitted true. And then we validate the form, which should make the stuff show up, okay? That's working fine. But then down here, when we check if the form has been submitted, we validate again, which should go up here and it should clear all the errors first. I think that's the issue, is that we never actually clear any of these errors. So when you call validate form, like we probably should reset this, right? We should probably be resetting this back to like name of empty string and description of empty string, right? So now we could run this test. Let's hope this makes it pass. And it does. So if you go back to the UI, submit it, type in name, type in description, everything works fine. Although there's another bug. When you open the modal, it still thinks that the form has been submitted for the first time. So we need to reset the is submitted back to false, right? Let's see if we, again, I think this will be the last test that we do. I think when we do like the open the modal thing, we should probably also just reset here, should set the is submitted to false when opening the modal. So every time we open the modal, like we have to reset that boolean back to false. So I'm going to go ahead and say is submitted is true. And then we're going to go ahead and open the modal and we want to make sure that is submitted becomes false. To be falsy. So again, let's just run these tests and let's verify that they fail. And they do fail because this is submitted is still true. So let's go and fix the implementation. So I'll go ahead and click on this one and I'm just going to say modal.is submitted is false. Go back, run my test. Tests are passing, gives us confidence hopefully that when you submit it, close it, come back, type, you don't get that weird state. So we kind of did a lot of things in this video, or I kind of showed you a lot of things. I showed you test-driven development, but more specifically, I showed you why, kind of reiterating on the video I published like a week or two ago where I said I like to separate my logic from my React components. This is why, because like it allows you to quickly write unit tests. And I know I didn't, I didn't really do the best job. I kind of got snug up on some stuff. But I mean, you can imagine like this little modal was pretty complex, right? It has different states to it. It has different validation states to it. This validation, like let's say we had 5 fields and some of them are dates and some of them are ages. How do you actually verify that the right errors are being displayed when someone adds in a date that's too small or a date that's too high? What if someone puts in like to an age input or an age drop down a string, right? So you want validation and you want unit tests to verify that what you're doing in the code actually won't break when people submit stuff. Okay. So I'm a big advocate of TDD and testing. It's a lot easier said than done sometimes. And sometimes it does slow you down because you actually have to take the time to think about like, okay, what is my code potentially going to look like? What is the interface to the state and what do the actions do to the state as I call them? That takes more time and more planning to think about, but in the long run, you get really good at just writing a test that has a describe box that says like, what am I trying to implement? And then you write a test to make sure that that thing fails before you even touch the code. And then you go back and you implement the logic to make that test pass. You get into this nice flow of like write a test, fail it, implement it, pass it. I guess it's called like red, green refactor. But it does actually help a lot. And the reason that I'm doing this whole weird, stupid MVC thing is because if you've seen any type of React component where you have like 15 use state hooks into it, it just becomes a super nightmare and you don't know how stuff is changing, especially when you start adding in more use effect hooks and you have use effects that are like listening for data changes. And it just becomes a huge asynchronous mess that it's just impossible to test, which is why I think a lot of people say, let's just integrate and do integration tests on our React components, because it's just too hard to do unit testing because you have all these things going on. And it's not that hard to do unit testing if you structured your React component properly from the get-go and separate the logic out of your React components. React is a dumb rendering library. That's it. The moment you start using the state that was provided with it, the moment you start using all these hooks, you've taken React and you've taken it from just a dumb rendering library to like a full-blown framework, right? Let me get off my high horse. I mean, I'm still kind of prototyping with this approach. I just want to have some fun with this, but hopefully you learned a little bit about TDD, and I enlightened you a little bit about how you can write tests to hopefully write better React components and logic. Have a good day and happy coding.